Okay, can people hear me okay on this at all? No? I'm not hearing anything? All right. Is that better? Aha. Hello. Let's try and release this. Okay. Hello, Seattle.
Check.
Well, we're here to talk about Jack Kirby, and I'm assuming that most of you here at least know that name, are familiar with that name. My colleague Charles Hatfield and I are huge fans, and we've decided to sort of divide the load a little bit today. I'm going to be talking about Jack's work primarily up until the move to Marvel Comics, and then Charles will be talking more about Jack's work at Marvel and the Marvel method, amongst other things. But we are also just going to sort of introduce one another because we thought this would be cute. So should I introduce
So this
you?
is Ben Saunders. Ben is a professor of English from the University of Oregon, where he has just launched this country's first ever undergraduate degree program in comics studies. Yes, thank you for that.
Thank you.
It's an important landmark and it's a welcome acknowledgement. Thank you. He's also the author of this book, published by Continuum in 2011, Do the Gods Wear Capes? Spirituality, Fantasy, and Superheroes. And he's the author of other books that I'm not seeing images of on the screen.
I don't have the John Donne, the 17th century poetry book. I didn't get an image.
Desiring Done, a 17th century poetry book from 2007, as well as Rock Over the Edge, a volume of rock music criticism that he co-edited. It came out back in 2002. He's also curated some remarkable exhibits of comics at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art right there on the University of Oregon campus, including one on superheroes back in 2009, a recent exhibit on Charles Schulz's Peanuts, and due next year, about a year from now, a major exhibit on EC Comics. Ben told me that one of his favorite Jack Kirby comics is Fantastic Four number 10, because of the way Kirby makes Reed Richards look so evil and yet still like Reed. If you know this story, Reed has been possessed by Dr. Doom. His body's been taken over. And Ben said he was really impressed by the way Reed continues to look Reed-like and yet evil. And also because Jack Kirby himself and Stan Lee are both guest stars in this comic. They appear as characters within it. Ben?
Yes, and my friend and colleague Charles Hatfield is an associate professor of English at California State University, Northridge, where he teaches comics, children's literature, and the study of popular culture. He is a longtime comics critic. He had more courage than me in that he's been working on this stuff from sort of the beginning of his academic career. I snuck my way into the academy doing other stuff. He's the author of Alternative Comics, an emerging literature, 2005, and the Eisner Award-winning Hand of Fire, the comics art of Jack Kirby, which won the Eisner for Best Comics-Related Publication last year, as well as many articles. One of his favorite Jack Kirby comics is OMAC #1, which is such a great choice because he says it is so deliriously screwed up, so disturbing, and such a dark, unexpected riff on the superhero, like an underground comic in disguise. So yay for Jack. Well, okay, what is Jack Kirby best known for today? Obviously, today Kirby is best known for reinventing the superhero at Marvel Comics in the 1960s alongside a writer and editor named Stan Lee. But Kirby had a long and productive career reaching all the way back to the 1930s, a career that encompassed a great deal more than these most familiar and well-known characters. The fact of the matter is that Jack Kirby could and did draw just about everything. Superhero comics, well, yes, of course, but also war comics. How are these images reading for you guys, by the way? They're nice enough? Okay, war comics, crime comics, science fiction comics, horror comics, Western comics, romance comics, and even funny animal comics. This thematically disparate material is united by the sheer dynamic force that Kirby brings to even the most ordinary of scenes. I have an example here actually from fairly late in his career. This is a pretty magnificent piece, double-page spread from an autobiographical story entitled Street Code about his early childhood. The Lower East Side of Jack Kirby's memory overwhelms the viewer with visual noise. It's not it's not just that almost every square inch of the page is filled. It's not just that the denizens of the city barely have room to pass one another on the sidewalk as they go about their daily business, as the detritus of their own energetic consumption raised down in the form of garbage, which I think is a pretty nice, vivid visual emblem for the rapid cycles of big city life. But it's also that all the social interactions here, you might notice, are aggressive. Communication takes the form of yelled abuse and hurled missiles, while peace seems only bought at the cost of isolating oneself in the newspaper. I don't know if you can see the guy in the newspaper on the corner on the left-hand side of the image there, or in the dropout status of the bum. And here from the same story, we have an image of the young Jack Kirby and his mother in the kitchen of their tiny $12 a month tenement apartment in Manhattan's Essex Street. Again, the crowded details create the impression of simultaneously cramped but vibrant space. Furnishings from the living room intrude at the doorframe and inner windows, even as other objects and the figure of the young Kirby himself push against and are cut off by the clean edges of the panel borders, adding to our sense of barely contained forces. All the internal angles, you will notice, are at odds with the four-square frame. And the less than perfect three-point perspective complements this lurching feeling of movement. Everything seems tilted towards the viewer, almost dangerously, so that you can imagine being splashed by water from that wash tub. It's a tenement kitchen, but Jack Kirby invests it with the chaotic dynamics of a modern combat zone. The comics industry has produced superior technicians in terms of the traditional illustrative skills of accurate perspective, realistic anatomy, and photographic lighting. But when it comes to the depiction of sheer kinetic energy, no one can match the king. So Kirby, as I hope this isn't news to all of you, but as some of you probably already know, was born Jacob Kurtzberg in 1917, the oldest son in the family of Austrian Jewish emigres on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the location of these scenes that we're looking at. His father eked out a meager living as a tailor, and money was always a problem for the family. Kirby was also, as many of you probably again know, shorter than average height. He barely reached 5'5", but he was notoriously scrappy. In fact, if Kirby's own accounts are taken literally, he appears to have divided his childhood between two main activities, fighting and drawing. Those were the two things that he did. He also clearly cultivated the demeanor of the New York tough guy in his early years, as this wonderful Edward G. Robinson-esque photo attests. His mother encouraged his drawing habit, buying him large pads of onion skin paper, which he apparently filled so rapidly that she would have to ration them out. He dreamed, it seems, early on of attending Brooklyn's Pratt Institute as a child, but he was disappointed when he actually enrolled, probably sometime in his mid-teens, and he quit rapidly. In at least one interview, Kirby portrayed himself as just too impatient for art school. I can't do the Kirby voice. Those of you who've listened to him and the clips on YouTube, you can just imagine this in the Kirby voice. But he said, "I wasn't the kind of student that Pratt was looking for. They wanted people who would work on something forever. I didn't want to work on projects forever. I intended to get things done." But in other versions of the story, he attributed his decision to leave Pratt to the fact that his father lost his job at the garment factory, forcing Kirby to abandon his studies and serve as a breadwinner. Now, I suspect that both factors, family poverty and Kirby's full speed ahead personality, played a role, but the upshot is that this great American artist was also an autodidact with no formal art training and no education at all from about the age of 16 onwards. Instead, Kirby learned on the job. His early professional career included a stint at the Fleischer Animation Studio, the home of Betty Boop and Popeye. And here is an example of his work as an in-betweener. He advanced while he was there to the position of assistant animator or in-betweener. That's the artist who draws the pictures in between key drawings, thus conveying the impression of motion by depicting each position between the defining extremes. To Kirby, this ultimately seemed too much like factory work. It was tedious and uncreative, and he soon quit. But comics historian R.C. Harvey suggests that this experience stood Kirby in good stead when it came to depicting superhero action. Years later, Kirby would recall his early days in the comics industry saying, "Nothing around really moved. Another strip might have one action in one panel and then an unrelated action in another panel, whereas I would have a continuous slug fight." If a guy parried, he would follow it with a thrust, and it would give the strip a little movement. And this is a sort of a very literalized version of that from Kirby's early work on Captain America, the thrust and parry logic that you can see. I think you can see it even more clearly in this work by the mature artist as he breaks down the sequence of motion in that middle strip of 3 panels. That there I really think you can see the training of the animator at work as the Hulk in this canonical battle with the Thing, breaks the fire hydrant and squirts the water at the Fantastic Four. Kirby also spent some of his apprentice years working for the Lincoln Features Syndicate, which is probably not as upmarket an organization as that sounds. Lincoln Features sold knockoffs of the most popular cartoons of the day to the newspapers that couldn't afford to pay for the real thing. If you couldn't afford Ripley's Believe It or Not, he was, some sort of knockoff equivalent. The job rewarded versatility and speed, and Kirby already had both. So here we can see him trying the role of editorial cartoonist, inspired by his lifelong detestation of Hitler. And here we can see his 2. And the thing I'd actually like to point out here, if you look at the names on the bylines, and here are 2 more, different newspaper strip tryouts produced under 4 different bylines. The different names on the strips are partly dictated by the sheer volume of Jacob Kurtzberg's output at this point in his career, partly by his desire to avoid complications with another employer, Fox Publications, where he was making a small but steady salary as a staff artist. Fox notoriously took a dim view of moonlighting, so Kirby was publishing under these other names. But there may have been a less practical side to all these different bylines. The artist seems to have been experimenting, as you can just see from the different styles, with different identities. Now, you remember, he's only 21, 22 years old at this point, and artistically he's still trying to establish a distinct identity for himself. And of course, it's also during this period that he first began using the name that would eventually come to replace the one that he was born with, Jack Kirby. And in later years, Kirby would acknowledge that he changed his name because, and this is a quote, he wanted to be an American, end quote. But he would also sometimes bristle at the suggestion that he first adopted his Irish-sounding nom de plume to disguise his Jewish heritage. And we can talk more about this if you want. I think it's certainly the case that institutionalized anti-Semitism is probably the ultimate catalyst for the name change. But the decision, I think, also reflects an essentially creative desire on Jacob Kurtzberg's part to refashion himself according to a more ideal image. There are anecdotes from Joe Simon that sort of attest to this, but the bottom line is that Jacob Kurtzberg seems to have found it hard to imagine himself as a success. He was too self-conscious and too insecure on many levels. But Jack Kirby might be a different story. Jack Kirby could be a force to be reckoned with. Now, shortly before he changed his name, Kirby had teamed up with an artist editor he met at Fox Publications named Joe Simon. Simon became Kirby's closest artistic collaborator and co-conspirator over the next 16 years, and with Simon handling the business arrangements, Kirby began to enjoy his first real success. As a team, they were a perfect fit. Both men liked to plot stories and invent characters. Jack was faster and perhaps a more focused penciler than Joe, but he didn't like to ink. I think that his aversion to inking is characteristic of his impatience. He was perfectly good at it, but he felt it was too much like doing the same drawing twice. Why would you want to do the same drawing twice? Joe, on the other hand, liked inking, and he had a strong sense of cover design and a more generally professional demeanor. So around 1940, this team of Simon and Kirby began producing work for Martin Goodman, a pulp publisher. Goodman's company went by many names, including Atlas and Timely. It would eventually become best known as Marvel Comics. And for Goodman, Simon and Kirby first put together a book called Red Raven. Again, I think this was just a tryout. It did not last more than 1 issue. And it's notable mostly for this backup Kirby story, Mercury, which is an allegory of the European war, starring gods of classical myth, in which Pluto has come to Prusland, I kid you not, under the name of Edulf Hedler. Pluto has come to Prusland under the name of Edulf Hedler. So again, you can see how consistently throughout his career Kirby identified Nazism with evil. This is 1940, this is well before Pearl Harbor. But the theme of a god amongst mortals is obviously also one to which Kirby would frequently return. Next, Simon and Kirby created The Vision. Yes, The Vision. A cool-looking character who traveled about in clouds of smoke and was very mysterious. Like a lot of Golden Age heroes, he had inconsistent powers and eventually 3 different origins. But it was their third creation for Goodman, Captain America, that Simon and Kirby struck gold. And again, this classic iconic cover of Cap punching Hitler in the face several months before Pearl Harbor. This is a political statement. This is at a time when DC are keeping Superman out of the war. So Cap was fast-paced and action-filled. This story from the first issue, this is the 4th story in the first issue, introduces Cap's great nemesis, the Red Skull, and opens with this wonderful attention-grabbing splash page. Compared to the art of Joe Shuster and his studio, or Bob Kane and his more talented ghosts, Kirby's action sequences are, from the beginning, more elaborately choreographed. As you can see, the bodies of the principals are constantly breaking the boundaries of the panel borders in this stage of his career, in marked contrast, again, to people like Shuster and Kane and a lot of other superhero artists. In the most powerful punches, Kirby twists and elongates the bodies of the characters. And here, Cap quite literally knocks the skull into the middle of next week, or at least into the separate temporal unit of the second panel. Now, unfortunately, Joe Simon suspected Goodman of using sophisticated bookkeeping methods to hide the full extent of the profits from this hugely successful title. So one version of the story goes that he called Jack Leibowitz at DC Comics and negotiated what was at the time one of the best page rates in the industry for a new line of creations, and then Simon and Kirby walked out on Goodman after just 10 issues, with the publisher having to scramble to replace them on the hit character that they created. In other versions of the story, that version, by the way, is the one that Joe Simon tells in his book, The Comic Book Makers. But other sources claim that Goodman actually learned that Simon and Kirby were trying to get a better deal from DC and fired them before they could quit. It sort of depends on who you speak to. Simon and Kirby's opposition to the Nazis was not confined to their fantasy lives. Both men were drafted in 1943, and Jack saw combat in Europe, and the experience marked him for life, as it did so many men of his generation. In 1946, he and Joe returned to an industry in flux. The superhero craze had peaked and was going into a slow but steady decline. But the comic book form itself remained as popular as ever. Funny animals, westerns, and Archie-style teen books probably enjoying the largest market share. And there was also a growing audience for darker, more salacious, and violent fare. Leading the way with this bolder content were the EC and Gleason publishing houses with their hugely successful lines of horror and crime titles. That crime, you can understand why parents were upset. Joe and Jack had no problem adding to these genres. Jack in particular seems to have identified with the gangsters and thugs, feeling perhaps that only his drawing talent had prevented him from joining their ranks. He posed as the crook in this photo cover for one of the crime titles that he published with Joe. But although the two men had fun with this material, a consistent hit in this glutted crime market perhaps eluded them. Again, it depends on who you speak to. Simon says Justice Traps the Guilty sold 1 million copies on its first issue. Hits in this period are a relative thing. But it certainly wasn't as big as Captain America. Their next major success came from a direction, in fact, that no one could have predicted. In Mark Evaniers' words, it came in 2 steps. First, there was My Date, which was sort of a romance comic, but skewed in this humorous Archie-like direction. And that did fairly well, and the experience emboldened them to do a more serious comic about love, dating, and marriage. But even Simon and Kirby were surprised at just how well this latest idea was received when Young Romance debuted in September 1947. It was unlike anything else on the stands, and it was a huge smash, the biggest Simon and Kirby creation since Captain America. Within months, they were putting out 2 or 3 similar titles, and within a year or two, all the other companies were following suit. There were about 150 romance comics being produced within about 18 months of the first appearance of Young Romance. It was massive. So Simon and Kirby had done more than create a new hit. They had, in fact, invented one of the most popular comic book genres of the late 1940s. And to this day, Kirby's romantic period, as it were, remains one of the most overlooked phases of his career. But Kirby himself was proud of his work in this genre. Not that he confined himself to it in this period. He kept working and experimenting in other areas. His wartime experiences led to a more grim and bitter take on the combat comics. I think that's a really powerful cover. while he combined his love of youthful gangs with the Western in a short-lived book called Boys Ranch. Although Kirby was producing amazing work in the early 1950s, and here's an example of the original art. This is Kirby inking himself, by the way, so he really could do it. Although he was producing amazing work in this period, the comics industry was itself heading towards a crisis. On the one hand, there was the encroachment of the new entertainment medium of television. On the other hand, a moral panic about the negative effects of comics, which had led to increased governmental scrutiny of the medium and intensified parental opposition. And on some kind of mutant third hand, for which I don't have an image, there was transformations in the comic sales were negatively affected by changes in the national distribution systems for comics and magazines. All of this sort of added up to a perfect storm in which sales fell and then tanked. Between 1954 and 1955, the total number of comic titles published annually, the statistics tell the story, fell from 630 to 250. How many industries can you think of that can afford to survive that contract by 2/3 in a one-year period? And the industry was in free fall with companies closing left and right. Now, with his managerial skills and professional demeanor, Joe Simon was able to find a job during these tough times as an editor at Harvey Comics. He also picked up work in advertising. Jack, however, was caught up in a lawsuit with the DC editor. And DC was by now the single largest employer remaining in this rapidly shrinking industry. So Jack couldn't work at the largest employer left. He therefore ended the 1950s at a very low ebb and was forced to turn to Martin Goodman. That's the same crooked businessman that Simon and Kirby had perhaps proudly walked away from just 16 years earlier after creating their first big hit. Goodman's line of titles was itself considerably reduced from the Golden Age heyday. He was now publishing just a handful of low-selling comic books a month, all under the general editorship of his nephew by marriage, a younger man that Kirby recognized as a former office gopher from his own early days at the company. The editor's name was Stanley Lieber, but in his professional byline, he went by the snappier moniker of Stan Lee. Stan before the toupee there. Stan probably recognized that fate had dealt him a good hand when it delivered one of the greatest comics creators in the business to the doorstep of his struggling second-string company. After all, by this stage, Kirby had been at the center of the American comics industry for 2 decades and had created a body of work of astonishing versatility and power. In his comics with Joe Simon, he'd already left a permanent mark on the form. If Jack Kirby had died in 1959 and had never gone to Marvel Comics, he would still have created Captain America and started the romance comics genre. He would still be one of the legends. He'd already left a permanent mark, expanding the aesthetic possibilities, broadening the generic boundaries, and inventing some of the most distinctive and successful characters in the medium. But to the world at large, comics were still a debased form, and Kirby undoubtedly knew that for all his achievements, most members of the population, over the age of 12 anyway, would have laughed at the suggestion that little Jacob Kurtzberg from the Lower East Side had grown up to be an artist, let alone one of the great American artists of the 20th century, which I would have no embarrassment about proclaiming him to be at this point. Nor were attitudes any better within the comics industry itself, at least amongst the owners and publishers who routinely exploited and exhausted their greatest talents, dismissing them as expendable and denying them the greatest rewards of their labor. So it cannot have been easy for Kirby, now 20 years into his career, to find himself earning meager paychecks at a minor publishing house with a moldy line in horror and sci-fi and Western anthology titles. I love this because Stan's fingerprints are so all over that hag hunter of helpless humans. Yeah, exactly. Isn't that fantastic? As moldy as this stuff was, if you look at the original art from this period, I mean, who wouldn't mind owning that? It's just fabulous. But there they are, working on moldy horror and sci-fi and Western anthology titles. But in 1960, something unexpected occurred. DC scored a surprise hit with a new superhero book, The Justice League of America. Goodman, always one to follow a trend, ordered Lee to come up with a rival team. The result would transform Marvel from a lower-tier publisher into the largest comic book company in America. It would also initiate a renaissance in Jack Kirby's already remarkable career, marking the beginning of a new creative phase in which Kirby, with Lee as his new partner, would launch a second generation of comic book superheroes capable of competing with the greatest characters of the Golden Age. I'm just going to show some of those images of those characters and let them speak for themselves as to why we should care about Jack Kirby, and then hand over to Charles. Different technologies.
Intermission.
It was almost smooth.
I saw a screening of 2001: A Space Odyssey a few months ago, and was surprised that they still had the intermission and interval music in it. So just pretend this is kind of like that. Thanks, man. So, okay, the remarkable second act of Jack Kirby's career, right? And during this period, Kirby gave comic books an expanded canvas. He gave them some scope, right? A sense of larger possibilities. In the 60s and 70s, superhero comics moved from an episodic to a more epic structure, or rather an epic and an episodic structure. And Kirby, more than any other single creator, was responsible for that. The fact that the superhero genre now so often deals with the apocalyptic, with the revelation, potential destruction, and recreation of worlds. Where's my image? Whole worlds at any moment. Ah, there we go, yes. See, the potential destruction of whole worlds. The fact that this happens in superhero comics so often now is a testimony to his influence, to Kirby's genius for the costume hero, but also his impatience with the genre as he found it, and the way that he changed it. Kirby jacked up the threat level in superhero comics. He broadened the range and scale of the threats. He introduced to the genre a sense of discovery. I'm getting the cue back here that I should pick this up. He introduced to the genre a sense of discovery, of secret history, of mythic origins, eschatology, the sense of endings and new beginnings, turning costume heroics into a means by which comic books could approach the grand, sort of mind-rattling themes of epic fantasy. So the fact that so many superhero comics today work at the level of the whole world or the universe or the multiverse is a testament to Kirby's peculiar gift. Comic books drawn and plotted out by him, including the Fantastic Four and Thor, and later comics entirely written and drawn by Kirby, like the New Gods and the Eternals, made the superhero genre a bridge between low and high fantasy. The grand and the cataclysmic on the one hand, the low mimetic, the comical or absurd on the other, the cosmic and the urban, the epic and the crime story, the sublime vista and the lowly grotesque caricature. Kirby knitted it all together crazily, vitally, giving the superhero genre a new infusion of energy that enabled it to survive and to seduce further generations of readers, right? And Kirby was able to do this for at least three reasons, all of which I discuss in my book, Hand of Fire. This looks a lot like lecture mode now, doesn't it? Sorry. You can take the professor out of the classroom, but you can't, okay. The production method at Marvel in the 60s, the so-called Marvel style, favored narrative drawing. That is, it put the cartoonist in the driver's seat narratively, allowing stories to be generated graphically through images as opposed to simply scripted and then illustrated afterward. Kirby's graphic imagination was never an abstract thing. It was always tied to the physical process of drawing. Pressurized by the relentless production demand at Marvel during the 60s, Kirby broke out. He slipped the tethers. He went wild. And in doing so, he provided the superhero genre with much of its vocabulary, its visual and thematic vocabulary. Oh, going too fast. Also, of course, Kirby had grown up professionally with the superhero comic. He had done costume comics from about 1940 onwards, as Ben showed you. He had seen the genre come and go, and so he was able to come back to it, to reapproach the materials of Golden Age superhero comics with a new degree of self-consciousness. So he knew what those comics had been before, and he could re-inhabit that genre in a more seasoned, self-aware way, reusing old characters and concepts, but cranking them up to new levels. You know, it goes up to 11. Right? This kind of self-consciousness, in fact, marks the whole second phase of superhero comics, you know, the silver age of the genre. A third reason, Marvel, driven in part by Kirby's genius for visual storytelling, and in part by Steve Ditko's, and in part by the genius of the system presided over by Stan Lee, pursued an elaborate Byzantine continuity among its titles, pioneering the concept of the shared world as the basic editorial strategy for work-for-hire superhero comics. Marvel was the first publisher to explore fully the potential of interlocking superhero comics as a vast narrative. And that's a phrase that I borrowed from two scholars, Pat Harrigan and Noah Wardrip-Fruin, vast narrative. A vast narrative is one that's multiply authored, sometimes massively multiply authored. It may last long enough for its fans to grow up and become official co-authors as well. Now, of course, by now, the vast narratives, the universes of Marvel and DC Comics have even surpassed comics, right? And they've gone on to colonize other media. So despite the inevitable incoherence of the universes created this way, worlds in which such disparate characters as Captain America and Thor, Batman and Darkseid can coexist and make demands on each other, despite this absurdity, you know, the notion of the shared world has proven very attractive, irresistibly attractive to storytellers, adapters, and fans in the decades since, nurturing comic book fandom, nurturing its focus on continuity and the potential of the crossover. You know, when Reed and Sue get married here in this 1965 FF annual, it was Marvel's ultimate crossover to date. Now, of course, Kirby didn't do all of this on his own, but his grand designs for Marvel and the sheer amount of raw material, the characters, designs, and premises that he gave to Marvel between 1961 and about the mid-decade provided the necessary scope for Marvel's story world and really for fandom's obsession with continuity since then, too. I mean, think about it. Okay? Much of the raw material for the recent Avengers film was first conceived and visualized in the basement of the Kirby family's home in Long Island in the mid-60s. And I imagine Jack Kirby sitting in what his family called the dungeon, right? Often late at night or into the small hours of the morning, throwing anything at the wall to see what would stick. It's kind of amazing to me that a lot of these things stuck for more than 50 years, right? I gotta make comics, I gotta make sales, and you can see the long-term results on the right. So I want to, more than anything, go back to my first point, the point about narrative drawing, because the biggest step that I made as a scholar while I was writing my book on Kirby was learning to think more about drawing as a process of generating stories, of making things up. We know that Kirby preferred not to work from full scripts, right? What he'd like to do was take his plot ideas and turn them into stories right at the drawing board. So what happened at Marvel in the 60s under Stan Lee's editorship set Kirby free, and other artists too, most notably the great Steve Ditko, set them free to draw stories into life. Marvel's prolificacy, its energy, its verve were owed to the narrative inventiveness of Kirby and a handful of fellow cartoonists. But I would argue none more than Kirby, who designed more aspects of Marvel's budding continuity than any other single person. Right? Now we know that Stan Lee set his artists loose to work out from and to build out from the basic premises of the Marvel comics. And we know that he often got from his artists much more, than the faithful execution of an agreed-upon plot. Right? What he got from Kirby was at the least genuine co-creation, and by that I mean genuine new premises. Right? Under the Marvel method, and here I'm cribbing for a bit from the text of my book, it was the artist that got the ball rolling narratively by independently creating breakdowns for the stories, meaning page layouts and drawings, at least rough drawings, often much more thoroughly detailed drawings. Only afterward would the nominal writer, right, supply the dialogue and captions. So the writer was more accurately a scripter or a reviser, a dialoguer who was responsible for placing text on already determined layouts. And these layouts, by the way, often included not only images but also rough textual notes penciled in by the artist to help explain the plots, right, as you can see here. So this production method called on the artist to break down plots and lay out pages on their own without minute page-by-page input from a scriptwriter beforehand. Right. Now, the Marvel method was a pragmatic adjustment in response to an unremitting production demand. Right? And Stan Lee and Marvel came to depend on it. Practically speaking, it freed up a lot of Lee's time, because he was not responsible for making decisions about breakdown or staging at the script phase, and he did not have to work through the details of physical action or confrontations. Those he left to the kinetic sensibilities of the artists. He also did not have to worry about dialogue until confronting nearly finished pages, or at least fully penciled pages, a mercy that allowed him to attack the pages as found objects, right? I think it's one of the things that accounts for that sort of improvisational flair that Stan Lee's writing has in those comics, that kind of vivacity or chutzpah that he has as a scripter, because he's got these things in front of him already. So Stan Lee was a willful translator. He was kind of reinterpreting the artist's sequences and intentions, writing over something that already existed in a substantially developed form. Sometimes his translations were faithful, sometimes they weren't. His work came most often at the fore end, in the initial consultation with the artist, and the aft end, the dialogue and captioning, leaving the middle to the artist. Okay, so what is in that middle, right? The all-important middle included, at the least, the layout, pacing, staging, the working out of transitions and minor plot points, and the choreographing of action. All the ingredients of sequential narrative drawing, cartooning, right? All the elements of page design, composition, reader orientation, of dramatic visual emphasis, tonal control, gesture, and expression, right? Now, in the case of Kirby, and Steve Ditko too, in the mid-60s, the middle also included much more. At the least, the occasional creation of major characters out of whole cloth. And, of course, the best-known undisputed example of this is the Silver Surfer. The frequent introduction of supporting characters, the staging of complex, extended, and emotionally fraught sequences, and moments of invention that startled Stan Lee just as they startled the readers. Jack, what's this? Well, Stan, right? There are multiple examples of this. So what Kirby and Ditko provided to Lee and to Marvel was not illustration, right? Not illustration with that sense that we sometimes assume, rightly or wrongly, about illustration, that it's a supplement to a story that already existed. That's not what Ditko or Kirby were providing to Marvel. What they were providing was concepts, characterization, plot points, and full-fledged narrative drawing, storytelling by way of images, with recourse to all the myriad devices, all the visual shorthand of cartooning. Right? Cartooning is storytelling. So while the Marvel method lightened Lee's workload as a scripter, it made greater demands on the artist's time. And so it reinforced those artists' sense that they were working on stories for which they should be able to claim some substantial creative credit. Now, as Stan's contributions to the initial plotting of these comics eased off, right, freeing him to act as the editor, production manager, and the promoter of Marvel as it expanded, Ditko and Kirby grew into their own, supplying entire plots and new properties, and eventually stamping their respective comics with their design sensibilities, predispositions, even their moral outlooks, right? All while Lee remained the credited writer of the books. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see why this was both a productive but also eventually an irksome arrangement for some of the people involved, right? So the reason superhero comics became so much, for me, became so much more vital and interesting in the mid-60s at Marvel is that Marvel, in contrast to the writer and editor-dominated culture at DC, and in contrast to the production of most superhero comics today, right, set talented cartoonists, narrative artists, free to dream up stories through their art. Right? The point is worth underscoring because it's still so poorly understood. The Marvel Universe did not arrive in purely conceptual form as a series of abstract, portable notions. Right? It always arrived graphically through narrative drawing. To paraphrase Donald Phelps, cartooning is not just the inscription of imagination, it is imagination's vehicle, a process of ideation, design, and, of course, world building. So between 61 and about 66, Kirby plotted and laid out overwhelmingly more comics and launched more new properties than anyone else at Marvel. He supplied the company with raw material at a mind-boggling pace. At the mid-decade, as if he was galvanized by the sheer production pressure, Kirby erupted, and the power of his artwork took a hurtling, headlong leap forward, rivaling the intensity of his best work pre-Marvel, but taking on a new and more massive, more rudely stylized kind of look. His design sense frothed over. His costumes, gadgets, and characters hit a new level of Baroque lavishness. By this point, Kirby had distilled decades worth of fury and struggle in his drawing. His figure drawing is a study in paradox. It fused swirling kinetic energy with the outsized presence and weight of classical sculpture. Figures of stone, men, women, creatures, who appeared to move with the fluidity and speed and grace of athletes or angels. Often Kirby dressed these impossible figures in equally impossible costumes that represented the triumph of form over function. You try wearing that. And then placed them in feverishly imagined environments. Spectacular cityscapes. Overgrown jungles. This is kind of a high-tech jungle, the Black Panther's kingdom. Crackling cosmic starscapes. Chaotic otherworldly dimensions. And palaces and laboratories filled with massive and mysterious machines. Monuments to the technological sublime, and also ways of kind of hypnotizing you as a reader and guiding your eye around the page, like, what is that, right? So as his art leapfrogged forward, this was kind of going along with developments narratively, because those two things can't be separated. Kirby began to treat the superhero as a vehicle for high fantasy and science fiction, which he had always loved ever since he was a boy. Uninhibited world building, graphic mythopoesis, we could call it. This was the order of the day. Kirby chased after ideas and visions that superhero comics had not had the nerve to chase before. This is from New Gods 5, published in DC after Kirby's Marvel tenure. Kirby's yen for the cosmic, for the gargantuan, and the technological sublime ushered in a sense of scope and possibility unprecedented in the genre. In particular, the Fantastic Four and Thor supplied the cosmic scale and the stylistic template for much of what's happened in the genre since. And as I recount in my book, Kirby pursued this aesthetic through many later comics, from the Fourth World to the Eternals to 2001, with mixed but always fascinating results. So that's what Kirby did to or for the superhero genre. Much of what has made that genre bigger and more ambitious, more epic, also frankly more specialized, more hermetic, more bizarre, crazier, right, started at Kirby's drawing board. The DNA of the contemporary superhero comic is in Kirby's Silver Age work. That's the case that Hand of Fire makes, and that's why I call Kirby Marvel's co-author and the household god of superhero comics. And that's part of the reason why we all should care about Jack Kirby. Thank you. What we got?
We will entertain questions.
That mic will be useful for questions.
Once Kirby started to, take on, it seemed like more of the story, the middle. How did he keep track of continuality, making sure that the character actually, what he wrote previously does follow through and make sure that that stays true?
I mean, I think Charles may want to say a little more about this, but he didn't sometimes, because that's the short answer is that he just. I mean, one of the stories that I've heard about the way Kirby composed on the page, and I've always found it almost impossible to believe because it seems so counterintuitive in terms of the way everybody else draws, is that, but people have told me that he started at the top left-hand corner and he just drew. And that was how, and so, which I think really confirms, if that is true, it really confirms Charles's argument, which is that he's driven by graphic storytelling. So it's not about designing a page, it's about starting here and filling in the boxes.
Well, he had a lot of ideas in his head when he sat down at the drawing board. For example, Mark Evanier tells this story about how the demon was conceived. It was conceived over a hamburger at a restaurant in a conversation, and Evanier claims that the guts, the basic plot of the first issue of that comic, arrived over dinner, right? And how he actually approached it is he pitched the title to DC with some character sketches and some scraps of text. And then when he actually sat down at the drawing board, he had no typescript or anything like that. So he did have something going on beforehand as far as ideation, invention. Publishers would, I know that Lee and Marvel did this, they would make photostats of Kirby's pencil art and return it to Kirby so that he could track continuity. And Stan Lee, and he wasn't the only one, but Lee certainly mentioned this, would have a lot of editorial fixes made because the costume details would drift slightly. Does Galactus have a G on his chest this month or not? I mean, things might drift. So there was a way in which there usually had to be some sort of level of editorial mediation or fixing or something for Kirby to refer back to, because he didn't have script for these comics, and he did make mistakes on the continuity side.
And even in terms of pacing, if you actually sit and read, say, the so-called Galactus trilogy, I mean, it actually starts halfway through a book which has wrapped up a story about the Inhumans,
and the trilogy ends in the middle of the third book so that Johnny can go to college.
Right, which is this extraordinary sort of collapsing of the cosmic and the quotidian. You know, it begins with like the world is about, God has just showed up and he's going to eat the world. And then page 12, we're done with that, and now Johnny's anxious about hanging out with Wyatt Wingfoot at college. I mean, it happens in the same 20 pages.
Right, right.
I think I see that we have the 2-minute warning, so we probably only have time for one more question, amazingly.
How do you think Jack Kirby would react to his creations being on such a massive scale now? Like, I mean, you see him everywhere from movies to figures to cartoons. How do you think he would react? Do you think he'd be like astonished that it's gotten so big? Do you think?
Well, I think the stories that Kirby told about his intentions as a creator probably changed as he saw the creations lasting, lingering, sticking around, staying. So he was much more voluble or articulate about, let's say, why he came, why he envisioned Galactus and the Silver Surfer the way he did years later. At the time, in 1966, no one asked him, right? There are a lot of anecdotes that suggest that there was at least a period in his life when he reacted bitterly because he was at loggerheads with the Marvel Comics administration or ownership, and so he found it sometimes, I don't know if this was always true, but it seems true that there were at least times when he found it difficult to be surrounded by those evidences of his past, and the sense that he'd been kind of disenfranchised. I mean, he was really proud, clearly, of the work he did, and he was always gracious to fans, unfailingly. You want me to sign this? I'm going to sign this. But he was at times distanced from his own creations.
Evanier tells a story about him feeling unable to go to the mall in the late 80s, early 90s with his grandchildren because the image, not just characters that he'd created, but quite often his drawings would be on T-shirts and underoos and lunchboxes, and he wasn't getting a penny for any of it.
My guess would be that he felt ambivalent, but proud. That would be my guess.
So I think we are at time, and thank you everybody for proving that some people still care about Jack.